Peppermint and whiskey.
I think it's more than well known.
That's also including, positive recommendation in terms of have we got all the herbs that we need that we can grow in this climate? And I remember seeing black pepper growing at the Chelsea Physic Garden, but it was inside a greenhouse against a south-facing wall, so it really needs almost tropical conditions, but that's a long-lived perennial. That's the slight objection to Chinese herbal medicine, because it uses such weird and exotic things, let alone all the animals they like to put in there.
They put steroids in some of them, you just don't know what you're
contaminated as well. But trying to source as many things as we can from supplies which we can actually grow ourselves. So, come back to herbs in the second half, and so I'll do just a quick resume of the potting mixes. So if you can open your tomes at the growing media.
What page is that, please? What page?
That's page 54.
Thank you.
Yeah, with these booklets, I've tried to arrange where there's a pair of leaflets relevant to each other, they're on the same page. And we'll go on to propagation in a bit. So an introductory little spiel about growing media. And part of this is, it's got the word potting compost. So that's the kind of colloquial term that we use for growing media. And that's a bit deceptive, and I've mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. And that's this fundamental principle. The way the chart is arranged is from those materials and inputs which have least fertility on the left side to those which have more fertility on the right side. So that's the concentrates. And that's relevant in terms of we want to sow seeds and strike cuttings into low fertility mixture. And if we started seeds and cuttings off in something that had even soil, let alone things like compost, manure and concentrates in, they either, in the case of seeds, the compost might still have microbes in which will actually eat the seeds as they start to germinate. If they don't germinate quick enough, and that's partly if they're sat there in cool conditions. So if you sow a bit early and they sit there before they germinate, the compost has microbes in it which will actually digest the seeds before they get to germinate. So that's one problem. And then if seeds and cuttings do start to root and they find huge amounts of fertility, more fertility than they need, then they'll actually stop and have a little tiny root system and not bother to make a bigger root system. So with those small plants, seedlings and cuttings, what we're trying to do is get the physical conditions of that medium right, but not to over-fertilise them. And I've said this before again, but a seed has enough energy in it to keep the young seedling going for at least a month. So thinking about the 8 stages of the plant's growth again, at each stage we want to pot on or plant out into a more fertile medium or soil. So if you start them off in really fertile conditions, even if they do grow, if you then planted them out into poor conditions, they get a check to growth, and that's very often what we get when we buy in plants, and they're grown to look great in the nursery or the garden centre or supermarket, and then when you take them home, if you plant them out into less fertile soil, they'll actually have a check to growth and won't grow as healthily as they could, or they'll have to start again. So just watch out. I've included the word potting compost, but in this case it doesn't necessarily have garden compost in it, and that's because a lot of people have heard the word and they've sown seeds and they've been diligently making their garden compost, which is highly fertile, maybe even riddling that, and then they sow seeds into it and they get failures because they're sowing into a fertile medium instead of a low fertility medium. That's the really, really crucial point about that. I'm just going to go through and make a version of these different growing media, starting with the cuttings one. And let's see what I brought along this evening. So for that, I've brought along this, which is gritty. And my soil naturally has not just sand in it, but bits of grit. And what I do is I'll get soil and leaf mould and riddle it. So a riddle is a really crucial tool for this task. And yeah, possessing a riddle, or I've actually got a set of riddles, different sizes. This one's like just 3-4 mil. Then I've got a 1 centimetre mesh and a 1 inch mesh. So depending on what mixture I'm making, I'll use a different riddle. If I'm making a fine seed compost, then I want all the particles in that growing medium to be as small as possible. So I'll riddle it all through the smallest sieve. And what doesn't go through the sieve, or riddle, that then gets used in this form as grit. So let's get grit to start with. And I've actually riddled everything already this evening, so we don't need to worry about that. And then adding to that, so I'm starting with that much grit. I'll add nearly as much, either perlite or vermiculite. This is perlite, it's the white one. The vermiculite is golden, and it has a different structure, it's more layers. And these are both superheated aluminium silicate or bauxite rock. And they tend to smelt aluminium where they've got huge amounts of electricity, because it has to be heated up to extract the aluminium. So it's often where hydroelectric power is made. But yeah, these are essentially like popcorn. So they'll heat up the rock, and because the rock has tiny little molecules of air in it, the heat expands the air within the rock, and then it forms a very light, open, airy material. So it's very light. It's used as insulation. So sometimes in house insulation you can get a bigger version, a builder's kind of grade of this, with larger particles. And that's one of the things that they actually fire into cavity wall insulation, like with a vacuum cleaner. So that's the explanation of that. And that's going to allow seedlings and cuttings roots to push in amongst and around this material without it getting in the way. And it will hold not just moisture but also air. And going back to when we were thinking about soil, plants need drainage, i.e. aeration in the soil. So then even the roots need to be able to get air to be able to function properly. And also for structure, this is just sharp sand. And with sand, you can get all different types of sand. Any rock can be ground down into a sand. Some places you get whole beaches where the sand is made of seashells ground out, that kind of thing, white sand. So this is sharp sand is slightly bigger particles than regular sand. You can get silver sand or horticultural sand, either which would be acceptable. One caution is sometimes if you get builder's sand and it's unwashed, you get salts, and especially salts wouldn't be good for young seedlings. But this has been washed, so that's okay. And add about as much of that. You'd want to get a pre-washed. No, that's just slightly gritty. So to feel it, hear it, it's rather than kind of round particles or squared off, they're just kind of variable size, but slightly sharp to the touch, really, that's all. So I've already got some leaf mould, which came in the grit. I've added the other non-biological additives. And then,
so you riddled the soil and took out all the fine particles, and what was left over you put in here. Is that what you just said?
I did, yeah.
Before, yeah. Okay.
Did I? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's rather than having to buy a grit.
Yeah.
I've made my own grit.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a minor. You can buy bags of grit, and that'll be fine. But it's a byproduct of the riddling.
Okay.
So either leaf mould, and if it's leaf mould that I'm riddling, then I've got no soil and no fertility in it. So I've actually riddled leaf mould for this lot. If I riddle the soil, then I might have a bit more soil left in it, and I might not want to use it for some purposes. But yeah, the value of working your soil, getting it weeds free, and then it's got extra benefits. And that's what I'm going to call a cuttings compost. So that's cuttings compost first. If you want to feel it and touch it, pass it around. You can feel it's got not a lot of humus in it, but it's the physical nature of that which will allow the young roots to get round the large lumps in it. That's number one. And then next one, I'll make some seed compost. And first, let's think about practicalities. Not everyone's made leaf mould, I know, because you've only just found out about it. Anybody have a stash of leaf mould? My mate who goes to Longshore, he was a bit miffed that they were buying in potting compost, and they wanted to sow some seeds, so he just went off into the woods and scraped off the surface and found broken down leaf mould actually in the woods. Now, if you do that too often, too much, you'd extract all the nutrients that are going back to keep the forest alive. So you wouldn't do it too much. And also, concern about peat. The less we use peat, the better. So it's not extracted and therefore destroying valuable wildlife areas. But I'm well aware that you might not have access to the alternative, which is leaf mould. That's lovely riddled leaf mould, really fine, feels lovely. One alternative for this is, instead of leaf mould on the chart, you could just think of multi-purpose compost. That might have peat in it. It might have all sorts of things in it, like slow release fertiliser in it. And when you buy multi-purpose compost, the principle there is, because it's got slow release fertiliser in it, you can actually sow seeds into it, and the fertiliser will only be released gradually as the plants get bigger. So that's why you can use multi-purpose compost to sow seeds. But my recommendation, again, to save money, if you're having to buy in that, it might have peat in it as well. It might have sewage waste in it, by the way, but grow bags often have some sewage waste in them, been processed. But yeah, instead of leaf mould, if you think multi-purpose compost is your substitute leaf mould, and you could use that in the same way with all these mixtures, and that would extend how much potting medium you get from a bag of multi-purpose compost. So that's a kind of intermediate tip.
So be careful if you're buying the peat-free ones, because the first stage of peat-free compost uses steamed wood shaving waste, which if it's very small is fine, but you're getting big pieces of like steamed pine bark in it. So for seedlings, you have to sieve it all and get it out because they've never. So
if you think about the consistency of sawdust, that's smaller particles, but it's still woody, but it's less damaging or less long-lasting than if it's kind of wood chip through the shredder.
Because it sounds like it's not, but some of them are just horrible.
There's some very strange mixtures coming along. A friend gave me some last year, and it was made out of all recycled materials. So it was broken up brick dust, and it wasn't actually that good, but it was recycled. But that's another tip. If you are buying in, you having to buy in some multi-purpose compost or these weird mixtures, peat-free alternatives, maybe don't rely on them solely. And if you could add the other things like a bit of sand and perlite to make seed mix, or a bit of your own soil added to the mixture if you're potting on larger plants, that will actually, again, flesh out what you're having to spend money on. But it also, your plants will grow better for the final position that they're going to grow in, and that's, if you have soil in the mixture, they're already used to that type of soil, whether it's a clay soil or a sandy soil.
What cuttings would you put in this one, Richard?
Cuttings, we're going to do that in a bit.
Oh, okay, right.
So that's stage 2. There's the block of coconut fibre again, imported, which is a burden on the planet. But that bit there will expand to be about 10 or 20 times the size when it's added to water. And there's a bit of made-up coconut fibre. It does tend to have longer fibres in it, and you might actually riddle that if you wanted to use it as a seed mixture to get smaller particle size. And that's if you're sowing smaller seeds. So the smaller the seed, the smaller the particle size.
It's like coir.
Yep. Yeah. Coconut fibre. So, switch over to the preferable materials. And, if this has been riddled through this riddle, then it's going to be fine for small seeds, but it'd be okay to use for larger seeds. If you've only got rough leaf mould, only 6 months old, you want to save that maybe just for larger seeds. But let's do a bit of a mix, pretty random. I'm not following percentages and I'm not measuring exactly because I've done these things before, and anything approximately right will be okay. You can check on the chart and see how much I'm varying from my recommendations. But, so there's a little bit of seed mix, it's about 1 litre. And we can add almost as much sand on top of that, about half as much. And again, about half a litre of the perlite or vermiculite. When you're using this, the one caution is some of it's dusty. So some of the particle sizes are really small, and if you're working in an enclosed space and creating lots of this fine dust, that can get on your lungs. And that's the same problem as we get with some pollution. It's the fine particle size that can actually be a problem, get on your lungs. So that is leaf mould with perlite and sand, mixing it round. If I'm working on a bigger scale and producing a bigger batch, I might work in a box or even an old bath, something like that. If I move these materials from end to end, then they end up well mixed together. And also you can see visually from the perlite that that's fairly thoroughly mixed in. So there's not a bunch of leaf mould on its own or a bit of sand on its own. So that's seed compost. And I'm going to call that a general seed compost. If it had larger seeds, we could use rougher leaf mould. And that's the value of saving the leaf mould for as long as possible and having mature leaf mould. And then you can use it for any of these purposes, including the potting on of bigger plants. But that'll be fine for small seedlings. So we've got cuttings compost and seed compost. And then I'll just do quickie with the rest. If I'm wanting to pot plants on, very often I'll actually use the leftover potting media that I used for peppers or tomatoes in pots the previous year, and I'll show you that that's with strong fertiliser in. But once it's been used for 1 year and most of the nutrients have been used up, I'll save that, keep it dry, break it down, and that is fine for just general potting on purposes. In this case, let's start with, we've got about 2 litres of leaf mould, and we'll have about nearly as much soil. Again, if I'm potting on small seedlings, then I'd have less soil. If I'm potting on a well-established plant, especially if I want to grow it on to maturity, then I might add a bit more soil. We'll stop there. That's about half as much soil as leaf mould to begin with. So that, on its own, would be okay for potting something on into, but it's going to be a little bit harder for them to get into. If you imagine the leaf mould in all these mixtures is really creating the right physical conditions for rooting, and in one sense, the leaf mould gets turned into roots, if that makes some sense, over time. But what will happen is the seeds and the plants will root through this medium. It'll be easy for them to get in between the leaf mould, and because the leaf mould is mixed in with the soil, they'll be distributing their roots in 3 dimensions in the soil, and then when they want water or nutrients, they can extract it from the soil. So for potting on seedlings, that would be acceptable. If I want to pot something on that's more mature, then I'd add some garden compost. So that again is nice mature stuff, that's 9 or 12 months old, and it's been riddled to take out too many lumps and bumps and stones, and that can be mixed in. So I've now got a bit of fertility, strong fertility in there. And then depending on what I'm potting on and what stage of growth it's at, I might start adding some of the concentrates. So I brought all the samples along to have another look at this evening. seaweed, that's mild or lowish in its fertility, so I can add a bit of that, and that would still be right for potting on little seedlings. If I put a bit more in, might suit a bigger plant. If I'm potting on something like an onion family or a cabbage family seedling, then I might put a bit of lime into the soil, especially if I had an acid soil to start with. And that would be a very small amount, not too much, but that would be preparing this mixture specifically for lime-loving plants. So that's what they can't do in the garden centre or the multi-purpose compost. They can't customise the mixture for the specific type of plant that you're potting on. If I'm potting on, say, tomatoes, and especially peppers and aubergines, which I tend to grow in big black buckets, and they stay warmer that way, then I'd add some highly concentrated fertiliser, blood, fish and bone, maybe hoof and horn, or this just chicken manure. So it's just a gesture. I'll put more in probably than that, not much left there. So that is going to give the plants a real boost. And that's, in the case of peppers and aubergines, they don't grow into huge plants, and their root systems can fit into a bucket like that size, about a 10-litre bucket. But I want to compensate, because I will be restricting their root system by putting them in a pot instead of into a border of soil, a bed of soil. So this is a balancing act in terms of the more fertility I put into this mixture, the more I could overfeed, especially the young plant when it's first planted out, and it might have a rush of growth, that might be lacks weak growth. So if I put too much strong fertility in here, I've got to make sure that I don't, that I manage that later on, make sure the plant doesn't get aphids and bugs and diseases, that kind of thing. And lastly, if I'm potting on something that's going to be in a pot for more than 1 year, more than 6 months, then I'll actually add some volcanic rock dust, and that will slowly break down over the course of 2 to 5 years, and that will keep the soil being refreshed and reintroduce extra nutrients into that soil over a long period. So if I'm doing fruit, or a long-term perennial that I want to leave in a pot for several years, then a bit of volcanic rock dust. So that's a complete kind of mixture, taking it either just a little bit of mild fertility to help them along, changing the nature of that medium to suit the lime lovers, pumping it up with lots of fertility for heavy feeder crops like tomatoes, peppers and aubergines, or making it last longer and yield nutrients in the pot for a lot longer with volcanic rock. And what I've got now is a fairly uniform looking mixture. Now, I'm not sure whether I've mixed in the fertilisers, the compost and the concentrates enough. And if I do this trick of just adding a tiny bit of perlite, doesn't have to be much, and then mixing again, when I've mixed in all the perlite uniformly throughout the mixture, and there's about as much perlite in every part of it, well then I know I've also mixed in the concentrates and the compost enough. Yeah? So that's a little tip. Now I know I've mixed sufficiently. And yeah, that will also help a bit with rooting. But yeah, if I want my growing media to look professional, if they've got a bit of the shiny white and gold perlite and vermiculite in them, they look much more convincing, simply from a kind of like looking point of view. The downside, again, to buying in plants is very often, there'll be problems like peat, and then these lighter materials like perlite, they put a lot more of them in, and they wouldn't put a heavy material like sand or soil in, because they've got to transport them all the way from Holland or somewhere, or air freight them in from somewhere else, and transport, the heavier it is, the more it's going to cost. So that's a bit of an explanation of the kind of plants that you buy in. But now I've got the potting on mixture and the seed mixture and the cuttings mixture. Does that explain the chart? Have I gone through all the bits on the chart? That's good.
Perlite becomes less important the older the plant gets.
It's especially useful for the young roots to form, the fragile little roots. If I'm potting on a well-established plant already, it could push its way through soil and leaf mould without the help of the perlite. It doesn't actually need that anymore.
If you're growing in pots and you're not very good at watering, like I'm not, you can buy in garden centres little tiny sachets of water crystal gel, things to retain water, which are about £5 for a tiny little packet like that. But you can buy in the supermarket big size crystals, absorptive crystals for cat litter, which are about £5 for a massive packet. And I've used that big stuff, and it doesn't seem to make a difference whether you use little stuff or big stuff. It still retains the water.
So it's a gel which, when wetted, holds the moisture for longer.
Yeah.
And typically that's sold as a hanging basket addition, because when your hanging basket is high up, you've got to water. It's hard to water. It dries out a lot. So especially if you're likely to be away or it's going to dry out.
If you're out at work for a hanging basket.
I just wonder what that's made of.
Silica? Yeah. Nothing that's going to interrupt.
It's not bad. It doesn't go away.
It's not going to mess up the content. Yeah.
Quick question, I know we're moving on late, but what's the difference between loam and soil?
So loam is when you stack up a load of weeds and allow it to break down and it becomes soil again. And typically, if you scrape up the turf off your front garden, if you had turf, and stack that up, that would turn into loam in about 18 months. So it's a slow composting, mostly soil-based. And that German mound garden that Ellie was impressed by, that's an example of a kind of loam-making process. But rather than throw away all your weeds and your weedy soil, stack it up.